Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the polls have closed.
And now Donald Trump will be America's 47th president.
As the vote is tallied, could legal battles change the course of this highly contested election in the United States? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Most of the ballots are in. A lot of the counting is done. And then this happened.
We overcame obstacles that nobody thought possible, and it is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy?
But what about the voters? How did the voting go? And what happens next? My guest today says he faced problems when he went to vote. I spoke to him on the morning of Election Day.
Hi, my name is Amir Badat. I am the manager of the Black Voters on the Rise project at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Voting Special Counsel. That means I'm a voting rights attorney, but focusing on political participation for Black Americans, predominantly in the South.
Amir, it's good to have you. Welcome to The Take. Let's start by talking about your own vote, because you decided to vote early before Election Day, and you got to the polls at home in Jackson, Mississippi. And that's a state that has a history of disenfranchising Black and brown voters, something that you, as you've just said, have worked on ending. So how did your voting experience go?
Yeah, so like you said, I live in Jackson, Mississippi, which is where I was born and raised. And so I went to go vote this past Saturday. Many people might think that anyone in the United States can vote early. Unfortunately, that's not the case. In certain states like Mississippi, there is no early voting. You need to have an excuse to be able to cast your ballot early. So for me, I was going to be traveling on Election Day for work. And so that meant that I qualified to be able to vote in-person absentee. And so I went with my family to the circuit clerk's office in Jackson, and we see this huge line wrapping around the sidewalk, around the corner, out the door in Hinds County.
So already, let me just pause you there, because already you have to be a motivated voter to make this happen. The fact that early voting is not really a possibility without an excuse, and the fact that you pull up and there's a long line stretching around the corner.
Exactly. Yeah. And I should also mention, I got there at around 10:30 in the morning. In-person absentee voting on that Saturday was only available from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. So for those 4 hours, you can go to try to cast your ballot. And we see the line, and I immediately turn to my wife and I say, there's no way that our 1 and 4-year-old are going to wait in line with us for this long. And so luckily, my wife was going to be in Jackson for Election Day. And so she had another opportunity to be able to cast her ballot. For me, that was my only chance. My wife got back in the car with our 2 little ones and tried to keep them entertained for what ended up being 3.5 hours of waiting.
Nearly
in line.
4 hours to cast your vote.
Nearly 4 hours to cast a ballot. And you know, in some ways I was encouraged, because the long line meant that people were motivated, people were engaged, they wanted to participate in the political process. But it was also discouraging in that we are still dealing with voter suppression in places like Mississippi. Jackson is one of the blackest cities in the entire country. Mississippi has one of the highest Black populations in the entire country. And so these types of issues, long lines at the polls, disproportionately impact Black people and people of color. The line was wrapping around multiple corners in the building. There were people who were trying to find chairs, people who were sitting on the floor. At some point, one person actually fainted because they had been standing for so long. And we were able to get cases of water into the building to hand out to folks to make it a little bit easier for them to wait in line and cast their ballots. But this is the type of thing that people have to go through in places like Mississippi to be able to cast their ballots. And there are solutions to it. And it's just a matter of having the political will within these states to adopt the solutions.
Well, you are in Washington, D.C. now. And I know that you are fielding reports of what the vote has been like for people, fielding reports of voter suppression and other election issues. What kind of issues were people facing as they tried to vote?
Some of the things that we've been hearing about so far this election cycle are things like incidents of intimidation against poll workers. We've seen and heard about bomb threats being issued to polling locations in Fulton County, Georgia. Overall, what I think is important to remember is that intimidation, violence is a very rare and uncommon thing in elections, but these types of things, bomb threats and threats against poll workers and election workers, do serve to chill participation. They make it more difficult for people to feel confident in going to the ballot box and casting their ballots because they fear for their safety. And so it's important for us to remember there are sufficient guardrails in the election laws to protect voters. But so far, we're seeing that there are attempts to undermine that confidence in the election. Some of the issues that we've seen in elections for years, things like long lines, things like people showing up to the polls and their names not being on the poll books, even though they've been voting at this particular polling location for years or decades even. We also see some things that you might just consider are mundane issues like signage. At a lot of polling locations that we visit in the South, that our monitors visit, we find that there is nothing that indicates that that area is a polling location.
Oh, wow.
Those are serious barriers that could result in people not actually casting a ballot.
So, Amir, we've been talking about the casting of ballots. Now I want to talk about where it might get even stickier, which is the counting of ballots. Let's talk about the legal contests that have already started in some instances. One of them could center on certification. Certification is basically a process where election officials attest that the voting is accurate. And that issue got a lot of attention back in 2020.
With such a close result and days of counting ahead, it's very likely this election will see court challenges to results in some states, as we've heard. Both campaigns are gearing up for legal battles, and the president has seemingly laid the ground to claim himself the victim of electoral fraud.
It's returning in this election now. What other legal issues are you expecting with polls closed?
So certification for a long time was not something that people really thought about or worried about or even knew about in many circumstances, because it was just a kind of ordinary process that election officials at the county level and the state level engaged in. An election official is basically putting the stamp on the election and saying, okay, the election is done. These are the results. After the 2020 election, what we saw were threats to the certification process in an effort to undermine confidence in the election.
Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Fred Keller says he won't vote to certify the election results because of how his home state handled voting. And
the reason that that happened is because there were narratives that were spun up by certain organizations. We call them election deniers. These narratives were designed to undermine confidence in the election. We heard narratives about the election being stolen. We heard narratives about ballots being hidden away and ballots being thrown away in garbage bags. And these were all reasons, justifications for not certifying the election. Luckily, in 2020, public officials did the right thing, certified the election, but we saw legal challenges to those acts of certification. We saw attempts by certain organizations to call into question the certification of elections because of mis and disinformation about the election being stolen. And that's what we're seeing again this election cycle.
There are some bad spots in Pennsylvania where some serious things have been caught or in the process of being caught, but the election itself is going very well.
What we've seen are these really troubling and problematic narratives about ineligible individuals casting ballots when there's no proof of that happening. What we've seen is our narratives about voter rolls being bloated, about all sorts of things that are designed to make us think, well, is this election being administered in the right way? And those are the narratives that have already been used during this election cycle to attempt to prevent county officials and state officials from certifying the election. And so I think that's what we're likely going to see over the next several days as we continue to finalize the election results. What we are working on at the Legal Defense Fund and several of our partner organizations working on making sure that certification happens, because certification is a mandatory duty. There's no discretion that a county official has or that a state official has in deciding whether or not to certify the election. Every state law says that it's mandatory, and we need to certify the election to trigger several other processes that are required for the peaceful transition of power.
More with Amir after the break. It's worth going back to the last election one more time because, of course, that also involved Trump. And before the results were clear, he said he would take it to the Supreme Court.
So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
Of course, for those who remember, the Supreme Court effectively decided the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000.
The ruling made George W. Bush the president-elect, ending 5 weeks of uncertainty following Election Day 2000.
What do we know about the role of the Supreme Court this time, and other courts for that matter?
So this has been the most litigated election, I think, in American history.
This one, 2024.
2024, there have been more lawsuits filed related to this election than any election in American history. And I think, I don't know what the latest number is, but we're in the hundreds of lawsuits that have been filed. Many of them frivolous and baseless lawsuits that have been filed by election denier organizations for the purpose of undermining confidence in the integrity of the election. And so I think courts have already played a really important role in ensuring that these efforts don't succeed and preventing, for example, county election officials in Fulton County, Georgia, from saying that they have discretion to certify the election. And so that's an encouraging thing. But at the same time, we've seen a few lawsuits that have succeeded and have been considered by federal courts and by the Supreme Court so far in this election cycle that will make it difficult for people to vote, or make it more difficult for people to vote.
Well, Amir, I also have to ask, when we talk about how it's affecting this election, some of these measures make it harder for people to vote. And I have to wonder, if you already have a slight fear, you don't really know what you're doing, maybe you're voting for the first time, and then you hear about these narratives of voter rolls being thrown out or people being accused of voting twice or not voting where they needed to, all of that just leads to the confusion around this day and could then prevent people from wanting to come out in the first place. Is that the point?
I think so. I think that there is a concerted effort. Voters experience these issues across the country, especially in states that have long histories of discrimination in the South. These are narratives that are being advanced across the country by organizations operating across the country. Many of these organizations are affiliated with each other in different ways or led by many of the same people. And they are affiliated with some of the same think tanks that generate these ideas and feed them to state legislatures to enact voter suppression laws, like we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, where we had historic turnout. We had a dramatic exercise of political power by Black individuals, by brown individuals, and we saw a backlash in the immediate aftermath of that historic turnout. And that backlash included January 6th, an attempt to overturn an election. But it also included a wave of voter suppression bills that were introduced and many of them enacted in the states in 2021, 2022, 2023, all the way up until this year. For example, in Texas, in 2021, Texas enacted what was called SB1, which was a really expansive voter suppression bill, but one of the parts of it banned what was called drive-through voting, used by Harris County, which is where Houston is in Texas, an incredibly diverse city. And what the data showed was used disproportionately by Black and Latino individuals. In Texas, the legislature specifically banned drive-through voting, even though there was no evidence of fraud or any other type of issue associated with that form of voting.
So you can get your coffee drive-through, you can get your fast food, but you cannot cast your vote and participate in the democratic process by drive-through.
That's what the Texas legislature said, essentially. And though that's just one example of how these attempts are being very, very targeted and coordinated across states.
The LDP, NAACP LDP, of course, is nonpartisan, but I want to put as fine of a point on it as you can, because I can imagine people are in our international audience listening and watching and saying, why make it harder for people to cast their vote? What is the thinking behind that? How would you answer that?
This is a backlash. This is a backlash to growing political power among Black people and other voters of color. And it's not something that this country has never experienced before. You know, we saw in the aftermath of the Civil War, after the abolishment of slavery and during Reconstruction, when Black people were finally provided the right to participate in the political process, across the South, Black people were taking political office. They were voting in very large numbers, registering to vote in very large numbers, really becoming a core part of the American political system. And what did we see immediately after that? We saw white supremacist backlash. We saw states in the South amending their constitutions and amending their laws to pass things like poll taxes and literacy tests. And that's what ushered in Jim Crow. And so this is not the first time that we're seeing this type of backlash to growing political power. One of the things that we've seen to address these threats to the post-election process that we've been talking about is that Congress in 2022 enacted a piece of legislation called the Electoral Count Reform Act. And what that legislation does is it creates additional guardrails on the post-election process that helps facilitate the peaceful transition of power. Both Democrats and Republicans in Congress were able to agree that something needed to be done after what we saw on January 6th. It's interesting that Congress was able to agree that we need to create more protections to kind of the structure of our democracy. But for a long time, Congress has not been able to agree on things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is a piece of legislation that would add protections against discrimination for Black voters and other voters of color. Congress has not been able to agree on things like the Freedom to Vote Act, which would create some of these baselines for all states that they had to adopt to make it easier for people to vote. We need to see states enacting laws that make it easier and not harder to vote. And we need Congress to enact legislation that creates more protections and sets baselines for all states to allow people easier access to the franchise.
Well, Amir, before I let you go, I'd like to know how you explain this to your 4-year-old who is in line with you. I have 2 2-year-olds, and so this is all above their head. But by 4, they might start understanding some of this or want to understand why were we waiting in line as long as we were. What do you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we had a conversation with my 4-year-old about this because he was actually there with us handing out waters. And so yeah, he had a lot of fun
already
doing that.
Participating, doing his civic duty.
we're trying. And so, you know, I've actually taken him to vote with me every single time I've voted since he was born. And so he understands, he's starting to understand what it means to make a choice and what it means to have some role in how decisions are being made. And so, what we told him is that, well, first we told him what you did really helped people. What you did handing out water, people were thirsty, people were waiting there for a long time. That really helped people. And we also told him that, people shouldn't have to wait in line for that long to make a choice, like the ones that we make when we go vote. And there are things that we can do to help make it easier for people to make those choices. And so I think he's starting to understand that, and he gets candy every time that he votes, so he gets really excited about voting, which is a good thing. But yeah, we're gonna try to continue to make that happen for him and keep him engaged in the political process.
Start him young. Amir, thank you so much for this conversation and for walking us through what's already happened and what could happen. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And that's The Take. If you like this conversation, there's more where it came from. We'll be continuing our election coverage this week. Check out our playlist for more from the U.S. campaign trail, all leading to the vote. And be sure to subscribe to the Al Jazeera English YouTube channel for the latest.